Focusing on the audience is the most important aspect of your communication strategy. It means that all these components of your strategy are set up in the spirit of who your different target groups are and what they want from you. You should be driven by how you can give your audience exactly that. Your question is always, how do we connect our objectives with that our audience wants? Now, how do you make sure that you are focused on the target audiences? In the typical setup in development cooperation, three aspects need a closer look. A, have you really considered all possible target groups? B, have you subdivided them enough? And C, have you made sure that you know all these people well? Did you do your research? In terms of the first issue, have a look whether your colleagues in your project or your stakeholders are maybe fixated on the beneficiaries as a target group. This is a common misunderstanding. There might be a good reason for your project staff to be reminded to bring tangible benefits and value to the intended beneficiaries of the intervention. This, however, is not the same as making them a target group for communications. I'll give you an example. Local politicians are likely to be a target group, since talking to them is often going to help poor people more than talking to the poor people. So the politicians are a communications target group. Yeah? So watch out for it and clarify it before it causes confusions with your colleagues when they mix this up. Let's have a look at what happens when you choose two large target groups. Many projects speak of general public or the interested public as being their communication target groups, especially when it comes to what I call homebound communications, that is communicating to groups in donor countries. The general public is such a vast group that it's highly unlikely your project has the resources to start any communication that could reach this kind of group. Besides, this approach can hardly be called targeted. And it's rather unlikely that your project topic appeals to so many different kinds of people. You definitely should break this group down for you to be able to handle them more effectively. What about the interested public? This one is also typical for development cooperation, and though it's quite a bit smaller than the general public, it's still questionable in terms of being tangible. Maybe it's even a bit of a delusion. Not that there are no people out there who are interested in the stuff your project works on. It's not that. The problem is more that the definition is tautological. You define the group as having an interest in your topics. Your job is to find out which groups and individuals have an interest. So here as well, you will have to invest time to break this group down into really existing groups of people and research them. So sometimes the challenge is not whether a certain group has an interest, but whether they actually exist out there. One simple test to find out whether a certain group really exists is that you come up with a sufficient number of names to be part of it. So if you can only come up with just a handful of names for your scientist, writer, or policymaker groups, then dig a bit deeper. I'll give you an example. Policymakers do hardly exist in smaller developing countries. Ministries there mostly comprise politicians plus administrators. And the latter usually often don't have the capacity to write policy. It's not seldom that donors pay for international consultants to write white papers for local line ministries behind the scenes. So that target group policymaker often doesn't really exist, which you'll surely find out when you test with actual names and try to send them emails, let's say. So, as mentioned under messaging, many professionals in development cooperation believe they know their audience and their needs and wants or even aspirations, which leads to non-conducive assumptions. You want to make sure you do really know who you want to reach out to. Start with a small team exercise to analyze your stakeholders. Which groups of people are in some kind of relation to your project? What similarities and differences exist in each group? Does it make sense to split them up further into subsegments? It is important in our development context that you first figure out who you want to reach with your communication. Brainstorm all segments and subsegments of stakeholders, and then in the second round discuss which group could be of interest from a strategic communications perspective. You might come to the point when you speak of roles as important intermediaries for certain groups, as creative people often do. Remember, having a strategic role could mean they could be used indirectly, and there are many different ways you can come up with doing this indirect approach. That's where your creativeness is in high demand later on. So even non-stakeholder groups could become important. Maybe there's a group of individuals who is left out of receiving benefits from your project. It's likely that they develop very different sentiments towards your initiative than your beneficiaries. It could, for many reasons, maybe be that they are even jealous. It's common that others view themselves as negatively impacted by your project activity, and it's also common for development communication to neglect their interests. In some instances, it can become super important for your project to target these people as well. Clearly, you would have to have a very different set of messages for them, and the entire approach is likely to be very different. So the soft stuff is the hard stuff. You will have to use your soft skills to deal with people that might not be willing to listen to you. That's the tough assignment, the hard assignment. So your strategy must include a long period of listening to them and publicly acknowledging the legitimacy of their standpoints before you can even start thinking about messaging them. Let's say, for example, you want to reach the ever-popular segment farmers. You have to begin by understanding that farmers can be defined in very different ways. In fact, you can split the segment up in hundreds of ways. Some samples include their gender, interests, geographic location, relationship status. Do they own the property, or are they just part of the owner's family, or just farm laborers? The list goes on and on. But the key is to realize that how you speak to a group of farm people who, for example, are female and have an interest in dairy is very different from speaking to a group of males who have a strong interest, let's say, in mechanization of farming. This breaking down of big groups into smaller ones is the key to making sure you're talking to people in a way that makes them feel you know and understand them. So much about being able to do this is about becoming comfortable with the data you get from your research. Now, a pro tip for those who are ambitious is to reach out to someone in your organization who works with data analytics and get yourself acquainted with how your corporate communications department, at head office maybe, tracks social media engagement and stakeholders on the channels they use. You're likely to get some good insights when you compare this with the observations you made about your own target audience. For example, how do they engage on social media? What topics are of most interest to them? Are there other tools or partners that you could use to get even more information about your kind of target group? It's really important to be thoughtful about understanding your audience group. That's because the only way your messages will have impact is if you speak with them in the way they speak and put the messages in the places where your audience spends the most of their time. A lack of audience focus often causes a lack of impact. So make sure you spend a lot of time on your audience planning and that you have a strategy in place that is flexible enough to be customized to each audience segment based on what you learn about them as you go along. To customize your communications to meet the needs of your target groups is simply to start with what you want to say and then think about what you know about the specific audience you're communicating to. It might mean you simply need to adjust the format from something that was written to something visual. Or it might mean your visual should include things that represent the audience. So in the example of the millennial women with an interest in computer science, your content might have a more scientific look and feel if that's appropriate. Finally, it may mean that the original spokesperson you had planned for a piece of communication doesn't match what your audience would resonate with. And you might have to find another spokesperson, or an additional one rather. The entire point is to understand that you're speaking to a diverse group of people who all have different needs and thoughts. Do your best to group them into segments based on these nuances. And then make sure your communication strategy takes into consideration what they need from you, where they will most easily find your message and how you can best resonate with them. Let's have a look at how you configure your communications goals. Take your prioritized list of goals and see if you can reduce them to 1 or 2. Yes, you heard right, 1 or 2. Why? Because that's what strategy means, focusing on where you expect most impact. Everyone running into all sorts of different directions with all sorts of tools is not a strategy, even if you plan it a year in advance. Here again, the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And what I mean is, you'll need to use all your soft skills to convince everyone on your team and maybe in the stakeholder group as well to let go of the lower priority parts. That is really hard. For a junior, nearly impossible. Everyone on the team has assignments that relate to communication. They will feel left out and say things like, but that's what we do. It needs to go into the strategy. And they're all totally convinced about it. That's what most development projects do. They throw everything into the strategy. You can try and sway your colleagues or stakeholders that leaving out certain activity from the communication strategy doesn't mean it cannot be planned and carried out. It's just not strategic priority, which has been taken care of with a special plan. So consider telling them that they will let go of a good chance for heightened impact if every communications aspect is forced into the communication strategy. But be smart about it. If you see that there's no chance there, leave it. Unfortunately, you are very unlikely to win on this. Yeah, that's just the way it goes. So don't feel bad about it when you can't get through with it. Why I suggest that you at least try it in any case is that this is an important opportunity for yourself to show that you know your communication stuff and that you are committed to impact. In development cooperation, allegations that communications showed no impact are very common, and it's a sour fact that often it actually does have a low impact. There are many reasons for this, and many of which are not the fault of communications. I don't want to go into this here, just so much. Setting up non-strategic, non-prioritized goals is likely to be one of the most common reasons for it.